All right, welcome back, everybody, to Bio 153. And today we're going to be learning about chemistry. So, why not some motivational music to get us ready to get into the right feeling to learn our chemistry for today's lecture? Okay, so this is the second half of chapter 27, which focuses on inorganic chemistry and acid-base balance, which is very important for the body. So we look at this first slide, and it's possible some of this stuff might be review. But here we have the pH scale, right? Here we have the pH scale right here. So the pH scale. And you can see here that the scale goes from 0 all the way to 14. Of course, if we have a various material that is low on the pH scale, like maybe 0 to 3, we consider this item to be an acid. Right? Something low on the pH scale is an acid. In contrast to material that might be very high in the pH scale, maybe saying from 12 to 14 for an example, this would be something that's a base, right? A base or something very alkaline. And there's also different types of acids and bases. Something very low on the pH scale, this would be what's known as a strong acid. And we'll look at some examples of strong acids in here today. In contrast to something that might be maybe 4 to 6 on the pH scale, this would be more along the lines of what's known as a weak acid. And then if you have something on the pH scale, per se, maybe 8 to 11, something around those areas there, we would have what's known as a weak base. A weak base. In contrast to something very high in the pH scale, where we have a strong base. And of course, anytime you have something on the pH scale at 7, the item is defined as something that would be neutral on the pH scale. Neutral. Right? Something that's neutral. Like water. Pretty important for our body. Water, H2O. And finally, well, when it comes to the pH scale, well, what exactly would you have as a definition? So the pH scale ultimately is looking at the amount of hydrogen ions in a solution. And you get an idea then of how acidic or how basic a substance can be. So again, a lot of this might be review, but critical as we go forward and learn our inorganic chemistry today, because I know we're all very excited to learn about chemistry, right? All right, woo, chemistry, yay! So here we go. Okay, so when we start looking at the idea of acid-base balance, it's important to know the pHs of these critical items. So we're looking at the normal pH of bodily fluids. So when we look at arterial blood, oxygen-rich blood, the pH here would be at about 7.4. And when we're looking at venous blood, oxygen-poor blood in the veins versus arterial blood in the arteries, that pH here of venous blood is 7.35. And that's also the case for interstitial fluid. Remember, that's the fluid found outside of cells. And then we have the intracellular fluid, ICF, which has a pH of 7 right at neutral. Two very critical terms that are key for you to know would be alkylosis and acidosis. So alkylosis and acidosis. So alkylosis is where we have a pH greater than 7.45. So the arterial blood's becoming very alkaline basic in comparison to the blood being acidic, acidosis, with a pH less than 7.35. And ultimately, a lot of this is because of movement of hydrogen ions where we have this change in pH. And there's only a very slim pH level that our blood needs to be in for us to even be healthy. A huge drastic change in blood pH could lead to death. Even slight changes in blood pH, we can feel that. So this is kind of the step-by-step process when we look at acid-base balance and how our body responds to the change in blood pH, all about the idea of hydrogen ion concentration. So first it all starts with buffers, chemical buffers. We have chemical buffers in our body. We're going to look at some of those in here today. And this is kind of a pretty rapid situation. These buffers, they start working within a couple seconds, like the bicarbonate buffering system we have in our body. So again, buffers are important because they help with sensing changes in blood pH, and they allow for the fact that you don't have drastic changes in your pH. They minimize those changes in blood pH. The next response is up in the brain with the brain stem respiratory centers. So they start to work within 1 to 3 minutes. They may alter your respiratory rate and depth of breathing. They may enhance it. They may decrease it possibly. And the last mechanism when it comes to changes in the blood pH with responses to changes in hydrogen ion concentration are the renal mechanisms, referring to the kidneys. This is the slowest process. It might take hours. It may even take days to actually affect the blood pH. And so kidneys are compensating for this change in blood pH in arterial blood. What we're going to take a look at next, some of this might be review, but it is very critical for you to have a good understanding of acids and bases. So imagine that you're in the chemistry lab. Maybe you're doing a chemistry lab in anatomy physiology, or maybe you're taking chemistry at Delta College. Maybe you're taking Chem 111 or Chem 112. And maybe you're doing this titration experiment. You have here 2 beakers with water, and maybe you're starting to go ahead and titrate hydrochloric acid into 1 beaker of water, and maybe carbonic acid, H2CO3, into the other beaker with water. Ultimately, as you do this, you're also keeping track of the pH. When you add hydrochloric acid into water with a pH of 7, ultimately, the pH is going to fall. and there's probably going to be a huge drastic change in blood pH here. In fact, hydrochloric acid, HCl, the hydrogen completely separates from the chloride ion. So complete separation, dissociation occurs, indicating a very quick, fast change in blood pH. And in this case, a huge change in the pH here of the water. In this scenario here, H2CO3, carbonic acid, you're adding that to the water. However, the pH is higher here, 4.5. Weak acid here versus strong acid. And so the pH change won't be as drastic. You'll have some hydrogen ions that break off the carbonic acid, but not all. So pretty interesting here. Again, hydrochloric acid, like I mentioned, is a great example of a strong acid because you have a huge change in blood pH, and you can see here that the hydrogen ions completely dissociate from the chloride. Over here, again, carbonic acid, H2CO3. You add that into the beaker of water. You have some hydrogen ions that break off like we see here. But a lot of the hydrogen ions remain intact with carbonic acid, hence not as drastic of a change in the pH here in the water. It's also important for you to know the definitions of an acid and a base. So acids, they are defined as being a proton donor. They're going to go ahead, donate their proton, or another term for the proton is simply talking about hydrogen ions, so H plus here. In contrast to bases, bases are defined as proton acceptors. So when the proton or the hydrogen ion comes off the acid, the base will receive it, accept it. And that's what bases do. So they accept these bases, the proton or the hydrogen ion. Okay? So a very important concept to understand this idea of acids and bases. And so we'll take a look at this for review here next, because it's very critical that you have a good understanding of this as we go forward and learn our chemistry. All right, so here we go, guys. So again, when we talk about an acid, the acid, again, is defined as the proton donor. Referring to, of course, the idea of the proton, we're talking about transferring, removal of hydrogen ions, such as when we think of hydrochloric acid, HCl, and this hydrogen comes off the chloride. In contrast to that, we then have the definition of the base. The base is defined as the proton acceptor. Okay? Proton acceptor. In other words, the base will receive the hydrogen ion. Is what we're getting at here. So let's what the base does. It will go ahead and will take up a hydrogen ion. So the acid will go ahead and release the hydrogen. The base will go ahead and pick it up. So let's look at some examples here of acids and bases so you have a good understanding. We mentioned some of the previous slide here, but a great example of a strong acid, of course, mentioned several times already, would be the hydrochloric acid, HCl. Great example. We use that in our digestive physiology lab. And it makes sense that the pH is 1. So obviously very low on the pH scale. Great example of a weak acid. For you to know would be H2CO3. So H2CO3, which stands for carbonic acid. So we're going to make some room here. I'm going to erase that here for you. That way we can actually write it on the board here for you. So, carbonic acid. And the pH for carbonic acid is going to be a little higher. So we'll again make some more room here. We'll erase our notes here. Okay. And the pH here is going to be, for carbonic acid, 4.5. Okay, 4.5. All right, bases. So a great example of a strong base for you to know that you use a lot sometimes in the chemistry lab is for your strong base. Is going to be sodium hydroxide. So that is NaOH, sodium hydroxide. And it has a very high pH. So the pH here typically is a pH of 12, pH of 12. And again, this is sodium hydroxide. So sodium, so SODI, and hydroxide, HYDRO, XIDE, sodium hydroxide. And then finally, a great example of a weak base is looking at bicarbonate. So HCO3, bicarbonate. We've talked about this before. So bicarbonate. Gonna run out of room. Put the E over there. So bicarbonate, bicarbonate, bicarbonate. And that has a pH, this weak base here, of approximately 8. Okay? So, very important to be aware of these notes here. So, hopefully you are picking up on this. So, very good. Okay, so buffers, right? Very important to know your chemical buffers. So, a chemical buffer is a system of one or more compounds that act to resist pH changes when strong acid or a base is added to the body. 3 major buffers that we're going to look at in here today. We have the bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphate buffering system, and the protein buffering system. So we'll be looking at the chemical equations and discuss where we find these systems working in your body. So here we go. Chemistry, gotta love it. So the first buffering system we're going to look at in here today is the bicarbonate buffering system. And these are the chemical equations that relate to the bicarbonate buffering system. So it's very important for you to know these equations. Okay, make sure you know them. When we look at these, the first part of the chemical equation is referring to what are known as reactants. So these would be reactants right here. The hydrochloric acid as an example and the sodium bicarbonate. Those are reactants. The other part of the equation here, these are the products which we are forming. So the weak acid here, this is carbonic acid, H2CO3, and salt. So we have our reactants. That's always the first part of the chemical reaction, and the second half of the chemical reaction are your products that are formed. So here we're looking at a situation where a strong acid is being added to the body. And again, it's important as we go through these chemical reactions together to understand again the definitions of the acid and the base. The acid donates the hydrogen ion while the base receives the hydrogen ion. So we'll go through this first reaction together. So first we have our hydrochloric acid, HCl, very strong acid with a pH of 1. What will happen is the hydrogen ion here will break off and will be picked up by the base here. This is the sodium bicarbonate here because the base receives the hydrogen ion. By doing so then, we end up forming this weak acid here, the carbonic acid. Notice that there's 2 hydrogen ions here. And then the sodium actually combines with the chloride and we form our other product, the salt. The bottom example here, where we have a strong base being added to the body. Our strong base example here is our sodium hydroxide, NaOH. And our weak acid here, H2CO3, carbonic acid. So what will happen, because acids donate hydrogen ions, not all the hydrogen ions will break off. So you'll have at least one that will break off here. So you'll have one that will come off and will actually then form water. So you have water as one of the products here. And then what you're left with then, your weak base. So sodium bicarbonate. So you may be asking yourselves, well, where do we find this buffering system working in our body? There are several important locations that you need to know. One location where this buffer is working in the body, we find this working in the digestive system. If you think about it, there's a lot of hydrochloric acid in the digestive system. So digestive system. This would also be working if you go back in time and we think of the respiratory system. So respiratory. So digestive and the respiratory system are major areas where this buffering system is working. But other locations, these are two major ones, but this would also be working when we think of the blood, circulatory. Definitely that would be acceptable. Okay? Our major locations here. And of course the kidneys play always a critical role, so with bicarbonate, so we don't want to forget urinary too. All right, so digestive system, respiratory system, urinary, blood, those are major systems where the bicarbonate buffering system is working. So again, what you need to know here, you need to know these equations, these reactions. I might very well give you a chemical reaction like this, and you may have to explain each part, identify each part, or I may say, hey, name the buffer system, and critical to know where we find these buffering systems working in our body. Next, we're going to talk about the phosphate buffering system. The phosphate buffering system. So, once again, we'll look at both of these chemical reactions here, equations. So we start with the strong acid being added to the body. Here's our hydrochloric acid again. Remember, we have an acid, hydrogen ion breaks off, and of course the base here will pick it up. So this is our sodium monohydrogen phosphate here. And so hydrogen ion is accepted by the base. The sodium and the chloride will combine together and we form our salt. And then of course we also form our weak acid here. So now we have our sodium dihydrogen phosphate as our weak acid. Down here, the example of the strong base being added to the body. So here's our strong base, our sodium hydroxide. The weak acid here we're looking at is the sodium dihydrogen phosphate. So again, it's a weak acid. Not all the hydrogen ions will break off. One will break off, will be accepted by the base. What we end up forming then, we have a weak base formed, and this will be our sodium monohydrogen phosphate. And then we also form water as well. So where does this buffering system work in our body? The major location here ultimately would be when we think of the kidneys. So urinary. Would be the major location. The urinary system. The last buffering system we're going to take a look at in here today is looking at the protein buffering system. Sometimes this is also known as the hemoglobin buffering system. And ultimately this system is looking at what's known as the backbone of an amino acid. Amino acid being the building block of proteins. There are two major side groups when we look at the backbone of an amino acid. And we're seeing them here. We have the carboxyl group and the amino group. So for the carboxyl group, the side chain here of the amino acid, you always have a carbon, 2 oxygen molecules, and a hydrogen. How this works then In a situation where maybe the pH is increasing in the blood, the carboxyl group, ultimately the response, if the pH is becoming more alkaline or basic, the carboxyl group then releases the hydrogen ion, hence what we're seeing in this picture here as a response. And by doing so, that helps to get the pH back to a normal level. The amino group is considered the basic group here, so the carboxyl group is considered the acidic part here. So this is considered the acidic part, and the amino group is considered the basic part. So in this case here, maybe there's a situation where the blood pH is falling, becoming very acidic. The effect of the amino group is that it will go ahead and it will receive a hydrogen ion. So the amino group contains a nitrogen, 2 hydrogens, and ultimately then, if the pH is falling, the amino group will pick up an additional hydrogen ion. So now we have NH3+. The effect here is that we get the pH to increase to get back to a normal level. So you may be asking yourselves, where is the protein buffering system working in our body? Well, one, I mentioned that sometimes it's named the hemoglobin buffering system. So the blood circulatory system. And also this works in your kidneys. So urinary and blood circulatory are two major locations where the protein buffering system is working all the time. Okay, so know your buffering systems. If I were to give you one of the equations, the chemical reactions, you need to identify the buffering system. You also need to know where they're actively working in your body. And of course, be aware of the different parts of the actual chemical reaction too. All right, this picture is looking at the backbone of the amino acid, which is critical when we look at the protein buffering system. So we can kind of see this here. Here we have the backbone of the amino acid right here. The amino group, again, is the nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. So here's the side chain here for the amino group, right? So again, in a situation, maybe the pH here, I should be looking over here. When the pH is falling again, we consider the effect of that amino group, and ultimately what happens, it accepts a hydrogen ion, and the effect is it helps to get the pH back to normal because the pH will increase. Right here's the carboxyl group. So the carboxyl group, remember that's the acidic part I mentioned. Side chain of the amino acid, you have the carbon, a hydrogen. Here the oxygen is double bonded here. Oxygen here. So again, if the pH is rising, it's coming too high. The carboxyl group, you can see here then, will go ahead and release the hydrogen ion. And that's how that process works. Okay? So we'll go through it one more time. Get our eraser board out here. All right. So again, the carboxyl group, we have the carbon, double bonded oxygen, and hydrogen ion. If the pH rises, the effect of the carboxyl group, it will release a hydrogen ion, and that allows for the pH to go ahead and fall, right? So the pH will decrease. Then if we look at the amino group, that's the hydrogen and the two hydrogen ions and the nitrogen. If your pH is falling, the effect of the amino group it will pick up a hydrogen ion. So now it's going to be NH3. So the effect here then of the amino group picking up that hydrogen ion, the pH levels then will increase, getting back to homeostasis. Okay? So very key to know these buffering systems. A very important equation in chemistry, and maybe some of you have learned this already if you're taking Chem 112, maybe you're getting into it in Chem 111, but I think it's a Chem 112 concept with acid-base regulation. Looking at what's known as the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. The Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. So here it is. pH, right, the amount of hydrogen ions in a solution is equal to the pKa plus the log of the base over the acid. What the pKa stands for here, it's a dissociation constant, and ultimately is a measurement of the strength of the acid or the base in a solution. This is something that you would do a lot if you were doing a titration experiment in chemistry. Based off the titration, based off of what you're adding, can really affect the pH of the solution. So, for an example, if we were to go ahead and break this down, if you were doing your titration experiment in the laboratory, if you were to add a significant amount of the base, ultimately, base added, see here, base added, here's the pKa typically right here, add the base, the effect then, of course, is that the pH will increase, go up, right? Or the effect, if we look at maybe you're adding a significant amount of acid to the solution. Now, of course, going this direction with pH here, ultimately the pH will fall. pH becomes more acidic versus alkaline now. pH decreases. So that's one of the important concepts of proper acid-base regulation. In this case, a solution maybe that you're working with in a chemistry lab. In this case, we are thinking about this in aspect of arterial blood. Based off the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation then, if you were to go ahead and derive the normal arterial blood pH, there's various different variables you would plug in to get this answer here of 7.4, which is the typical normal arterial blood pH in the body. So we must ask ourselves, well, what happens when the arterial blood pH changes? And this will lead us now into looking at the various acid-base states, the four major ones that can occur with certain people, changes in their blood pH. So the first acid-base state we're going to take a look at in here today is taking a look at the respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis, also known as hypoventilation. And of course, hypoventilation is referring to respiratory failure. So someone can slip into this state of respiratory acidosis when their blood pH falls. So blood pH is decreasing, the case of acidosis. And then likewise, an increase in carbon dioxide levels, the partial pressure of CO2. Based off of these changes then, if CO2 is going up, oxygen is going down, you end up with these different respiratory conditions, such as a patient that's struggling with chronic bronchitis, emphysema. Remember, if you just have one of those conditions, we're talking about COPD, or even cystic fibrosis. So the pH is falling, your blood pH can't be too acidic for a period of time, so ultimately what's going to happen, it's going to affect the kidneys of this person. Hence the idea of renal compensation. The goal here is to try to get the blood pH back to normal. So the kidneys will be impacted here, And this will actually lead to an increase in bicarbonate levels. The kidneys will go ahead and they'll hold on to excessive amounts of bicarbonate, of course a weak base, to get the blood pH back to homeostasis. So this is the first condition here we're looking at, the respiratory acidosis. The next situation we're going to take a look at here is known as the respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis. In this situation here, the patient will have an increase in their blood pH, alkalosis referring to alkaline, so blood pH will increase, become more basic. Also, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the body will fall. A lot of this is because the patient is more likely than not probably hyperventilating is a possibility. So hyperventilation. So they're exhaling at a very fast rate with significant release of CO2 gas. So hyperventilation is a major cause here. A lot of that it can be brought on from significant stress in someone's life because of lots of anxiety, maybe an anxiety attack, panic attack going on with the anxiety, fear and pain sensations of just overload of the sympathetic nervous system. This can also be brought about because of hypoxia, someone with altitude sickness, or even asthma or pneumonia can bring this on. With altitude sickness, typically someone experiences the acute mountain sickness at about 8,000 feet here. And usually they'll feel this mountain sickness. It can be really brought on by dehydration. And then usually there's a bad headache, dizziness, maybe even diarrhea or vomiting even. So definitely it's important to stay hydrated, drink a lot of water with the altitude sickness as they're having the respiratory alkalosis here. So important to drink lots of water, stay hydrated, drink Gatorade. There's different medications they could be taking, maybe Tylenol for the headache. So oxygen may be needed if they're very high in altitude. Critical. How does the body respond to this? It will be the impact of the kidneys again, renal compensation. So a decrease now in the kidneys holding on to bicarbonate, more of that will be released through tubular secretion, and that's critical in order to get the pH back to normal, is losing that weak base. The next acid-base state we're going to talk about in here today is the metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis. This is one of the most common situations that people get into. The blood pH falls again, becoming very acidic, and also a huge decrease in the amount of bicarbonate in the body. A lot of that going out through the kidneys. Here are some of the common causes. These aren't all of them, of course, but some of the typical ones. Someone who's a diabetic, if they don't control their diabetes, they're type 1 or type 2, they might easily slip into this metabolic acidosis state. Sometimes this is also known as the ketoacidosis. Someone who's an alcoholic might easily slip into metabolic acidosis. The individual, the child in starvation mode, most definitely. Maybe they're living off of ketones. They may be in the ketoacidosis state. And even someone with severe diarrhea also could end up in this state. The body can only keep this low blood pH for a period of time. And so the body compensates, your breathing will be impacted. So that's the idea with the respiratory compensation, a decrease in the partial pressure of CO2 levels in the body. The final state we're going to take a look at here, acid-base state, is the metabolic alkalosis. So metabolic alkalosis. So here, the blood pH has increased significantly, very alkaline basic, and also a huge increase in the amount of bicarbonate. So the body's holding on to a lot more. One of the common causes for someone with this situation, this acid-base state. Maybe they're addicted to various medications that are very, very alkaline. So someone that's taking maybe Tums, a lot of sodium bicarbonate there. So that could really lead to a huge increase in blood pH. And of course, vomiting, losing a lot of acids out of the stomach could lead to this down the road too. The body can only stay in this state for a period of time. So ultimately then, breathing will be impacted. So respiratory compensation with an increase in the partial pressure of CO2 levels. So make sure to know these 4 basic acid-base states. Very critical to be aware of them. No clinical examples. We've gone through some clinical examples here. Be aware of how the variables change in regards to each of these. Now, a good way to fully understand these changes in arterial blood pH is looking at a very important graph, which we're going to take a look at here next, coming up. So the graph we're going to be focusing on very shortly is understanding the Davenport diagram, this graph. And understanding, reading this graph, how these acid-base states, how they come about, how the variables are impacted, and to know clinical examples. So we're going to look at this next. In your course packet, under the lecture handouts, you're going to find a very large Davenport diagram graph. So this is a good time to get that out right now when you're at home working on this. Also, you'll find a handout that says Bio 153, Chapter 27, Acid-Base Regulation Problems. So this is a good time to work on those at home right now for practice to know how to use the graph. And I also have an additional supplement material from a respiratory physiology book that goes through acid-base balance using the Davenport diagram graph. So it's time to find those and work on these together. Here we have the Davenport diagram graph. So how do you read this graph? This isn't any ordinary graph. So this figure below shows the normal point N for human arterial blood. Here's N right here on the graph. That's the normal point. How you read this? When you read the pH, that is the typical way you read the graph, where you vertically go down. And for example here, the pH here would be 7.4. However, you're going to be reading the graph differently when we look at the partial pressure of CO2 gas and for bicarbonate. PCO2, partial pressure of CO2, that's referring to the lungs here. That's referring to the respiratory system. And here we have bicarbonate, that weak base, right? So weak base. And this is referring to the work of the urinary system, the kidneys here. And I can fix that here for you. All right. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide gas, again, is referring to the lungs. Okay, so how do you read the measurement of the PeCO2 levels? You're actually going to follow this diagonal line up here. So you don't go directly up vertically when you read the amount of the PeCO2. So the levels here would be 40. So 40 would be the amount of the carbon dioxide levels here. And you can see here, this is kind of in increments of going through here, kind of 20 per se. 80, 60, 40. This is supposed to be 20 over here. When it comes to reading the level of the bicarbonate over here, HCO3, the weak base I mentioned, right? Bicarbonate, right? Bicarbonate. You also follow over here diagonally on the graph. So that level here for normal, someone who's healthy, is 36 millimoles per liter. Okay, so how about we'll start going through these problems together here. And I'll go ahead and I'll erase this here. And the first one we're going to work on, we'll just go right in order. Number 1. So let's do number 1. So number 1, letter B. We need to look at the graph, the Davenport diagram graph, and we need to go ahead and determine the acid-base state for number 1, letter B, and also go ahead and list one clinical example of someone in this state. When you read this graph, you will always start at N, the normal point. So when we go from N, make our way to B. Here's letter B on the graph. We've noticed some changes here. The pH has gone down. So this is definitely an acidic condition. So now the pH is 7.2. There's also been a change in the amount of carbon dioxide. We went from 40 to 60, an increase. Because there's been a change in the amount of CO2 gas, we know that this acid-base state here is a respiratory state, and it's respiratory acidosis. Okay, so letter B is the respiratory acidosis. So respiratory acid dosis. So that's letter B. That's where we're at right here. That's the acid-base state, respiratory acidosis. And to give a clinical example, you could put, there's a variety of things. You could put COPD here, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, cystic fibrosis. Any of those would be appropriate for this first one, number 1. Okay? Now we're going to do our next one. All right. Number 2. So number 2, we're looking at the acid-base state indicated by letter E on the graph. So we're going from N normal, and now we're going up, and we have a patient that has slipped into this point on the graph, letter E. And we'll circle this one more time here. There we go. Okay, so things that have changed, right? We went from a pH of 7.4. pH has increased now to 7.6 on the graph. So we definitely know it's going to be a state of alkylosis. And there's also been a change in the amount here of the bicarbonate. We went from a normal 36, and we read this line here. Now it's 48. The bicarbonate has gone up. So letter E is representing the acid-base state known as the metabolic metabolic alkalosis. So metabolic alkalosis. Okay, so clinical examples of somebody in this situation. Again, someone that could be taking a lot of medications that are very alkaline or basic, with a lot of sodium bicarbonate like Tums. Someone that could be doing excessive vomiting as well, because you're losing that acid. So that's number 2. All right, number 3. So number 3, we're looking at the acid-base state, which is letter C. So now we're going to go this direction on the graph. And here's C. So definitely one thing, again, we're looking at alkalosis, so an increase in blood pH going to 7.6 here. But we've also had a change now in the amount of PCO2. So normally that's 40. Now it's 20. So that has dropped. So this is a state known as the respiratory alkalosis. So respiratory alkalosis, the blood pH has increased and the PCO2 levels have fallen. So examples of people in this state, again, would be someone who's hyperventilating. They're very anxious, anxiety-driven, stress levels very high, panic attack occurring, brain trauma, injury, hypoxia, acute mountain sickness can bring this on. So that's number 3. Now we're going to take a look at our last acid-base state today on the graph. And that's looking at problem set number 4. All right, number 4. Looking at position letter G. So going down like this, here is letter G on the graph. So what's happening here, we move from N to G. Well, definitely the blood pH is falling, going to 7.2, so we know it's going to be a type of acidosis for sure. So definitely a type of acidosis here. And we can also see there's been a change in the amount of bicarbonate. So normally that level is 36, but now it's dropped to 24. So this is going to be the case of the metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis for position G. So this would be, again, a patient who is maybe an alcoholic or a patient who's fasting, starvation mode, maybe eating disorder, maybe even renal disease, severe diarrhea, and definitely uncontrolled diabetes, because metabolic acidosis sometimes is also referred to as the ketoacidosis. Okay, so those are the 4 basic acid-base states. But it's also important to understand how to get the blood pH back to normal, which is looking at different forms of compensation. So we'll go ahead and we'll erase these items here on the board and look at the idea of compensation. Okay, so looking at the next problem here, looking at 5A, we need to go from G to F. And this is not an acid-base state. It's simply we're trying to get the blood pH back to normal. And there's going to be some type of giveaway, some type of compensation occurring with a particular organ of the body to get the blood pH back to normal. Because we're at 7.2 right now in the graph. We got to get to 7.4. So going from G to position F is going to be a type of compensation. Okay, that's what number 4 is all about. Going from G to F here. Question number 5. So there we go. Add that on here for you. 5A. So going from G to F, getting that blood pH back to normal, what's changing is the amount of CO2, where we did have 40 here, and now we dropped to 20. So there's been a decline. So we know the compensation here will be respiratory for 5A. The compensation will be respiratory for this patient. So breathing will be impacted in order to get the blood pH back to normal. All right, doing the next one here. We're going to look at 5B, going from C to F. So good times ahead for sure. All right, so looking here at our graph, 5B, going from C to F. So we start here at position C. So again, this is a patient that has the respiratory alkalosis, and we need to go from C to F on the graph. The big thing that changes here, we got to get the blood pH back to normal, which we will from 7.6 to 7.4, but the bicarbonate amount will be impacted. You're going from 36 millimoles per liter down to 24. And because of that change in bicarbonate, we know the compensation will be defined as renal, referring to the kidneys here. Okay, the next one we're going to go through is number 6A. So we'll go ahead and we'll erase our work here. So 6A. And we need to go from position B on the graph to position D on the graph. So we start here with B, and we need to go up to D. So B, we're looking at respiratory acidosis here, and we need to go up to D. This is critical, again, to get the blood pH back to normal. So the big thing that changes here, of course, we need to get the pH back to normal because we're starting at 7.2 here, right? But there's going to be a change in the amount of bicarbonate, going from 36 to 48. So because of the change in bicarbonate here, the compensation will be, once again, defined as renal. This will be renal compensation for 6A, B to D. Okay? And then our last one here that we're going to do, 6B. So looking at number 6, 6B. So going from position E on the graph to position D on the graph. So we're going to start, here we are, N normal. Here is E. So a patient that has the metabolic alkalosis, and we need to get the patient to D to get their arterial blood pH back to normal, to homeostasis. So what's going to happen here then, going from E to D, of course the pH will go back up to normal, but the breathing will be impacted here. So you have, starting off, 40 for your partial pressure of CO2 gas to 60. And because of the change in CO2 with the lungs, compensation here will be considered to be respiratory. So this is going to be the respiratory compensation, okay? This is respiratory compensation. So definitely practice this. You need to know how to use this graph. Very critical to understand how to use the graph. So make sure to practice this. Very important that you can identify the 4 basic acid-base states on this graph and understand what happens with compensation, if it's renal or respiratory. Anytime it's a compensation that's renal, it's referring to a change in bicarbonate, the weak base. Anytime the compensation is respiratory, it's a change in the partial pressure of CO2. So definitely practice this. Practice makes perfect to understand the graph. And you'll have a lot of practice doing the homework if you start to work on it this week. You got to know how to do this because it might very well be on the next quiz on chapter 27. And you might very well see lots of questions related to reading this graph on your final exam. So definitely make sure to practice this, and then you'll be golden. These pages here just show you some additional causes for these acid-base states again, the metabolic conditions and the respiratory conditions. So here are the metabolic conditions, and here are the respiratory conditions. So you gotta love chemistry, man. So definitely keep working hard. And of course, if you need assistance, all you have to do is contact me if you need help with the chemistry.